Cultural History of Race and Antiquity, which I think is fantastic. Also, she never had the good fortune of having Denise as an editor. She's amazing at that as well. I mean, really. Okay, so all that's to say, I'm very excited about today's talk, and I think it will really be a valuable experience and a really elucidating and interesting one. So the title of the talk is Race Mixing and the Fall of Rome, the Role of Eugenics in Early 20th Century Literature. All right, let's give her a round of applause.
There is a handout in the chat. If you want to access the handout, it's in the chat.
And most of the things on the handout I'm going to be making reference to, but I personally like to have copies of things sometimes when I'm seeing dense text. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully before my cat jumps in and starts giving the paper, because he's dying to do that. So I just want to start by offering my sincere thanks to David and Jackie for the invitation to speak. David didn't really say this, but both of them were in the volume. So we've been able to do some really, I think, interesting collaborative work. And it's just really exciting to be able to continue that in all sorts of different formats. So really excited to be part of it. I wish I could be there in person, just didn't work out this year, but hopefully we will all be together again soon. And, you know, I'm always really happy and very excited to be able to give a talk, because I think that giving talks is just a really great way to get out of your own head, you know. So I've been thinking about these things. I've been trying to do some work on this. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about it. And I'm, you know, really happy and looking forward to taking questions and any kind of discussion afterwards. I want to also recognize the National Endowment for the Humanities for their support of parts of this research. I just want to add that the conclusions that come out of this are entirely my own. And, you know, I don't say that lightly, but because I think it's absolutely essential to protect the integrity of the NEH and its role in keeping the humanities vibrant in the United States at this particular moment in time. And I also want to mention that the NEH helped fund a documentary on American eugenics, which premiered a few years ago, I think 2018, on PBS's American Experience. And if you get the chance to watch it, it provides really excellent context for some of the ideas I'm trying to track in American classical scholarship of the same time. So finally, I just do want to give a content warning. This talk includes really difficult ideas, and they are mostly discussed through direct quotation of the original sources. And I often go back and forth about whether or not to show images of the people who produced some of these quotations. I've chosen to here, but it's not a decision that I sort of take lightly, or, you know, it's certainly open to critique. So I just want to acknowledge that some of this material can get quite intense. Okay. In an interview in The Atlantic in the summer of 2018, author James W. Loewen was asked to reflect on the current state of American education. Loewen was approached not as a casual observer of long-term educational trends, but rather as a scholar who has been deeply immersed in examination of the ways history education is framed and packaged for American students. Research widely disseminated in his 1995 book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, which analyzed, among other things, the current state of American high school textbooks. Responding to the fact that his book was being re-released in paperback, Loewen suggested to the Atlantic Reporter that it, quote, had new significance owing to detrimental developments in America's recent public discourse, end quote. When asked what had changed in his thinking since the original publication some 23 years ago, Loewen explained, quote, and part of the quote is on the slide, not all of it. He said, "Not much has changed in my thinking, and that's because I think I was right in the first place. What has changed has to do with our current intellectual era. History and social studies, as taught in school, make us less good at thinking critically about our past. For one, textbooks don't teach us to challenge, to read critically. They are just supposed to provide exercises and stuff to learn. Secondly, the textbooks and the people who teach from those textbooks don't teach causality, and that's really something I want to focus on. They aren't designed to have students memorize anything about causality, what causes racism, for example, what causes a decrease in racism. That means that those of us who are more than 18 years old and are out of high school and voting may have never had anybody teach us anything about what causes what in society," end quote. Lowen's comments resonated strongly with me because at the time the article appeared, I was in the midst of conducting a survey of the content of major American classical journals between roughly the years 1900 and 1950. In looking at both the formal articles and some of the more informal content of these journals, such as editorial notes or letters, my main goal was to track the intersections of eugenics and American classical scholarship in the first half of the 20th century. But even as I sought to comprehend the shape and scope of American classicists' turn to eugenics, it was impossible not to witness the larger ways classical scholars were seeking to define their practice as classicists during those decades in light of cataclysmic world events, not least 2 world wars. In short, contrary to what Lowen found in contemporary textbooks, classical historians of this era were deeply invested in finding causality, struggling to identify why things were unfurling around them so tragically, and considering how that might relate to what they were seeing in the ancient world. The teaching of causality is, of course, essential, as Lowen says, but it seemed to me that Lowen's claim did not admit the troubling impulses that often attend causality. For identifying the proximate cause of complex social and historical events can at times lead to unsatisfying, if not morally dangerous, conclusions. And I just give as an example, one AP headline reporting the horrific shooting that took place at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh on October 27th, 2018, for example, implied that unlocked doors rather than, say, guns were to blame or might have been to blame. And although early classical scholars were deeply invested in probing a range of reasons, especially economic ones, and that's very true in the first half of the 20th century, behind various ancient phenomena, many writers weren't so much interested in addressing the causality of dynamics like racism, but in positing so-called racial character and racial capacity themselves as the cause of fundamental historical change. Okay, but there's another additional way that I would like to set up my talk. So part of it was really thinking about Lowen and what it means to ask causality when you are a historian. So the other angle that leads me to this talk was, as I was working my way through endless volumes of classical journal in the summer of 2018, the first line of an article from 1910 entitled "Commercialism and Roman Territorial Expansion" caught my eye. It read, and this is the quotation on the slide, "It is commonplace of prefaces that historians often reflect the spirit of their own epoch in the interpretation of past ages." And this sentiment, of course, is far from exceptional. But what struck me is that its author was Tenny Frank, the very scholar whose application of racist ideology to the study of Roman history had partially set me off on this project. For Frank had argued in a very influential 1916 article that the so-called mixing of Eastern peoples with Roman stock was responsible in large part for Rome's so-called decline and fall. And I will definitely be coming back to Frank in this talk. And I certainly don't want to claim that he resides or inspires this talk in any simplistic way, but his open recognition that scholars live in the world and write from that standpoint provides an important starting point for this talk today, as does the question of causality itself. My ultimate concern, however, is to leave you with the conviction not only that classical scholars of the early 20th century used contemporary ideas about race and eugenics when crafting their interpretations of the ancient world, but also that they sought in turn to bolster the eugenics of their own day by using the ancient world to issue dire warnings and to locate historical precedents for modern American racism. So in the talk that follows, I would like to map out some of the trends I have been encountering in my research. And just a few sort of preliminary points. My project is primarily concerned with American classical scholarship, even though I understand that such definition threatens to draw an artificial boundary around the United States, not only because eugenics was a global phenomenon, but also because many American classicists in the early 20th century had in fact been born outside the United States, or were the children of immigrants, or had received at least part of their training abroad. But while survey of these journals suggests that American classicists remained defensive about their status in the beginning of the century, so they saw themselves as belatedly entering a field that was dominated by Europe. And as the decades passed, they were increasingly dedicated to staking out a distinctly American way of doing classics. So that's part of what I'm addressing here is you can see them really struggling to define their classical practices as American. And this was a practice that came to be defined against Germany in particular. Okay, generally speaking, contemporary ideas about race were applied most prominently by scholars of this era to two main historical so-called problems: the alleged racial origin of the ancient Greeks and the so-called fall of the Roman Empire. And in this way, they are clustered roughly at the beginning and end of antiquity. And there's a reason for that, which I'm happy to talk about more, but you may sort of understand why some of that happens as part of the talk. I will focus here today on the Roman side because those conversations seem to me to reflect specific anxieties about two distinct groups in American life: immigrants and emancipated Black Americans. I will touch on the Greek debates a little, but they often involve a particular investment in thinking about purity in relation to racial origin. And this was something that was much more difficult for scholars of this era to posit about either the Romans or about the American population itself. So they're turning to Rome very specifically because they're not thinking about a society that was deemed to be racially pure. Okay, and so I just want to talk a little bit then about ideas about race during this time before getting into eugenics more specifically. So critical race theorists have identified the modern 19th century as an especially important period for establishing the foundations of modern ideas about race. And many of you know this on this talk, and many of you students, I'm sure, have heard this from some of your teachers. But this was a time when ideas about the natural world were increasingly challenging structures of thought, such as religion, for primacy in explaining the world and its evolution or its progress. As these burgeoning scientific disciplines became applied to questions of human variation, perceptions about both the source and the meaning of race were radically transformed. And just to give one example, during this time, American racial theory switched from the belief in monogenesis or single origin, which had come from something like the Bible, to a belief in polygenesis, that there were multiple origins. This new scientific treatment of race generally encompassed 5 basic propositions, and they were often illustrated through elaborate charts and systems of classification, such as the one you see on the screen. So first, that human beings could be divided into separate categories based on the observation of select features like skin color. Second, that these groups could be ranked according to a hierarchy, so that groups could be made and then they could be ranked. Third, that external characteristics correlated with internal qualities. So for example, that head measurements could reveal things like brain capacities. Fourth, that such characteristics were inherited. And fifth, that groups were innate and unchanging, created by nature or God, depending on the perspective of the author. And the idea of races as being innate and unchanging was especially important to American racial theory. Significantly, even as race itself was progressively framed as a product of biology and science, ideas about race, as well as their attendant racism, were also becoming central to historiography, the thinking and writing about history. So that by the 19th century, as Martin Bernal has written, quote, the idea that history should consist of the biographies of superior races flourished, that was supposed to be the goal of history in the 19th century. And there's certainly ways in which the ancient Greeks themselves got appropriated into this enterprise. And you can see, as many people have written about in this racial chart, you see the use of an ancient or of a Greek statue of the Apollo Belvedere, the bust of the Apollo Belvedere. And as an example of that, Aubrey Diller in 1937 wrote a work called Race Mixture Among the Greeks Before Alexander. And he captured what was this sort of prevailing view among historians about the importance of race. And he wrote, quote, the problem begins and ends in history. For it was first raised when it began to appear that races had a history and functioned in history. And the results of the argument must in turn be applied to the interpretation of history, end quote. While intellectuals of the late 19th and early 20th century used so-called racial science, and especially methods like craniometry or the study of skulls, to identify and assert the natural superiority of certain races, Some, including Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, also pointedly outlined the dangers of so-called race mixing, a concept intimately related to concerns about deterioration and decline. So the entire way that races were constructed through racial science made the crossing of these boundaries between races a particular anxiety. And that's what I'd like to talk about. Then the way that this anxiety over race mixing infiltrates classical studies. By the beginning of the 20th century, the concept of race mixing and its attendant assumptions about the natural boundaries separating racial groups had made its way into American classical scholarship, often eliciting overt comparisons to contemporary US society. Not surprisingly, given the longstanding interest in using classical antiquity as a mirror for American life. A 1910 review of the literary history of Rome from the origins to the close of the Augustan age, for example, professes that, quote, "It is interesting to observe, especially for us Americans, that the Romans themselves were undoubtedly of mixed blood." So that was from 1910. In an article in Classical Journal from 1922, L.B. Mitchell drew a more ominous lesson from the Roman analogy, identifying a presumed decline at Rome, one ostensibly wrought by the presence of slaves and their effete Greek culture. And this is the role of slavery is a continuing thing that we will see and talk about. Mitchell concludes, and this is on the handout, and oops, I don't have a slide of it, but it is on the handout. So this is what Mitchell says. The Roman melting pot had received into it more than it could melt and fuse together. This situation, no doubt, contributed largely to the collapse of the Roman Republic. And it gives pause to thoughtful Americans who have seen in the last 4 years that our melting pot has not fused its ingredients to the extent that had previously been imagined, end quote. Mitchell's phrase, the last 4 years, presumably references the growing anxiety over immigration, which had led in 1921, a year before Mitchell published his article, to the passage of the Emergency Quota Act. Although this act had been introduced as a temporary measure, its provisions would subsequently be renewed, drastically curtailing immigration into the United States for decades. One estimate suggests immigration was reduced by 97%. The basic formula it proposed for defining immigration quotas by geographic origin, in fact, would remain in place until the 1960s. And as the PBS documentary notes, these were the policies that would be used to devastating effect to deny entry to European Jews fleeing from Nazism. And in fact, Anne Frank's father unsuccessfully sought entry into the United States on multiple occasions. Even as classical scholars made use of the modern terminology of a melting pot to describe Roman social dynamics, and this was a term that had come into general use in the United States in 1908 after a play by the same name, and that's on the slide. Many social critics in turn used classical analogies to diagnose what they considered the ills of American society, including rampant industrialization and the waves of immigrants who had been coming since the 1890s, not so much from Northern Europe, but from Eastern and Southern Europe instead, meaning Catholics and Jews. And the emergency quota that I just mentioned would be aimed at limiting entry to those specific groups. It targeted, in particular, groups like Italians. In 1916, Madison Grant, and he's someone I thought a lot about whether or not to project, but here he is, a lawyer heavily involved in the American eugenics movement, infamously coined the term cloaca gentium, or sewer of peoples. And I found out more recently, excuse me, he didn't coin it, but he's using it from someone else who coined it, to highlight what he considered the disintegrating urban landscape. Writing in his book, The Passing of the Great Race, and this was a book that Hitler would admire, the quotation on the slide, quote, "Large cities from the days of Rome, Alexandria, and Byzantium have always been the gathering points of diverse races. But New York is becoming a cloaca gentium, which will produce many amazing racial hybrids and some ethnic horrors that will be beyond the powers of future anthropologists to unravel," end quote. Grant went on to lament that in such an environment, one in which the tenement and the factory dominated, the so-called Nordic man would have little control over any resultant mixture, terming the process rather, quote, "from the point of view of race, the survival of the unfit." And trying to, he has a lot of mental gymnastics to try to figure out why this so-called Nordic blood, which is supposed to be strong, can't withstand racial mixing. And that's really another kind of subtext of a lot of this writing, is both the paranoia of it and then trying to really wrap their minds around exactly what the consequences are of what they are saying about things like Nordic blood. Given the philological roots of classical studies, it's perhaps not surprising that notions of race mixture were often applied by classicists to the study of language in the new century. Citing the assessment that, quote, language is really the surest of all known tests of race, Richard Wellington Husband argued in 1909 in his article, Race Mixture in Early Rome, that there was a racial difference between patricians and plebeians in ancient Rome, meaning that unlike the Romans, Sabines and Etruscans, who allegedly comprised the patrician class, the Ligurians, who made up the plebeian class, could be shown by their language, but then he added, and also by their blood, not to be Indo-European. In 1922, Frederick Shipley applied the concept of race mixture to the question of literary genius, setting out to consider not just race mixture's effect upon the development of genius, which was a real preoccupation of eugenicists, but also the effect more specifically, quote, of the penetration of the subject race by the blood and something of the spirit of the conquering race. So again, very literal ways of thinking about race mixture coming out of blood. Before looking at the literary development in 4 Roman provinces, North Italy, Spain, North Africa, and Gaul, Shipley laid the groundwork by defining, quote, the racial texture of the conquering Romans. And this is also on your handout. He argued, quote, that the Roman race was itself a mixture, is recognized by all ethnologists. The substratum of the population, like that of the Spanish and the Greek peninsulas, was the Mediterranean race, a people short and slight of stature, long-skulled, dark-haired and dark-eyed, and olive-skinned of a distinctly artistic temperament. This race, because of its better adaptation to environment, tends to absorb into itself in the course of time all infusions of foreign and particularly Northern blood. So he's really directly addressing that idea of Nordic blood, whose special features gradually disappear. And so he's really thinking about the relative weakness of Nordic blood, but he doesn't have some of the kind of attendant panic that people like Madison Grant did. And in fact, there's some interesting and I would say radical parts of his argument, even though there are intensely problematic parts of his argument as well. And the interesting thing, I think, is that he doesn't embrace the idea of Nordic. But Shipley does, in the article, endorse the idea of early invasions from the north, ending in about the year 1100 BCE, and this correlates with the so-called Dorian invasion of Greece, which, as many of you know, is a really prominent way of thinking about racial origins on the Greek side. Reiterating the conclusions of a scholar like Husband, Shipley proposes that, quote, these invaders, according to ethnologists, formed in Rome, as in Sparta and elsewhere in Greece, the patrician or the growing class, which long maintained its purity of blood through conferiat marriage. And we're going to see that marriage and family structure also becomes a major interest of these scholars. Shipley, so class, marriage, all of this will recur. Shipley insists, however, that the Nordic and Mediterranean blood, once mixed, to use his language, was eventually blended racially into a homogeneous whole, adding that, quote, foreign conquest had not yet begun to pour into Rome through the slave classes, the blood of every country about the basin of the Mediterranean Sea. And so this is the intensely problematic part of his article. On the one hand, he didn't believe that Nordic blood was inherently superior. He didn't necessarily believe in the kind of class analysis that people were doing, but he did believe that in later eras of the Roman Empire, that slave blood in particular would have a deteriorating effect. And we will see that picked up by others. Okay, but I would like to return to Tenny Frank and his 1916 article, Race Mixture in the Roman Empire. And this had quite different conclusions from Shipley's work, and it exerted influence for decades, both inside and outside of classical studies. Frank begins his article by noting the, quote, surprise that the historian usually experiences upon his first visit to Rome, end quote, whether it be walking through various museums or perusing the tombs on the Appian Way. For although the historian might be looking for names out of Cicero or Livy, Frank observes that he finds praenomen and nomen promising enough, but the cognomena seem all awry. And this is his quotation. What should we make of names like Pamphilus, Alexa, and Philostorgus? Do these names, asks Frank, imply that Roman stock was completely changed after Cicero's day? And this next part I put on your handout because I really will keep coming back to this question. And if so, are these foreigners ordinary immigrants, or did Rome become a nation of ex-slaves and their offspring? And I really want to highlight that because a lot of what is happening in these writings is the kind of explicit juxtaposition of those two groups that were so important in contemporary American life, immigrants and emancipated Black Americans. So looking at the influence of immigrants versus ex-slaves. Frank goes on to observe that, quote, most of the sociological and political data of the empire are provided by satirists, and he sets out to test their comments via a close study of the names preserved in the corpus of Latin inscriptions. And he goes through this methodology in some detail, and you can see a lot of belief in the sort of objectivity that he's deriving from data, which is a huge part of eugenics. But Frank's examination of the inscriptions ultimately leads him to conclude that, quote, Juvenal and Tacitus were not exaggerating. It is probable that when these men wrote a very small percentage of the free plebeians, and he's using the word plebeians here, on the streets of Rome could prove unmixed Italian descent. By far the larger part, perhaps 90%, had Oriental blood in their veins. And by Oriental, he means from the East, meaning generally Greeks and Jews from places like Syria and Asia Minor. So I just want to underline that here he's talking about plebeians because he'll make a very subtle shift later on. And later he concludes about the Roman world. This shorter quotation is on your handout. It is evident that the whole empire was a melting pot, again, that word we've seen before, and that the Oriental was always and everywhere a very large part of that ore. Advocating by the end of the article that, quote, a more thorough study of the race question be made, Frank insists that, and this is also in your handout, this orientalizing of Rome's populace has a more important bearing than is usually accorded it upon the larger question of why the spirits and acts of imperial Rome are totally different from those of the Republic, if indeed racial characteristics are not wholly a myth. There is today a healthy activity in the study of the economic factors, unscientific finance, fiscal agriculture, inadequate support of industry and commerce, etc., that contributed to Rome's decline. But what lay behind and constantly reacted upon all such causes of Rome's disintegration was, after all, to a considerable extent, the fact that the people who had built Rome had given way to a different race. The lack of energy and enterprise, the failure of foresight and common sense, the weakening of moral and political stamina, all were concomitant with the gradual diminution of the stock, which during the early days had displayed these qualities. So you can see everything that he's attaching to blood and race, all of these qualities. Although Frank emphasizes the overall so-called degeneration of Roman stock, in his conclusion, he does attempt, he does that in his conclusion. Earlier in the article, he does attempt to probe more fully the problem of change of race at Rome, such as, quote, why the native stock did not better hold its own. And again, you see that we've already seen a lot of that anxiety involved in the idea of race and blood mixture. Why doesn't certain blood, why isn't the superior blood able to hold its own? And what he suggests, which is also on your handout, the significance of this whole question lies in the fact that race suicide, then as now, curtailed the stock of the more sophisticated, that is, of the aristocracy and the rich, who were to large extent the native stock. And here, where I think he's making a really it's not that subtle, but a really important shift from what he was talking about before with the plebeians now thinking about the upper class. The rich, who he says to a large extent were the so-called native stock. Reiterating the causes behind the failure of Roman noble families to so-called perpetuate themselves, Frank admits the possibility of significant losses through warfare, which is something I will also return to. But ultimately, he returns to the trope of race suicide, arguing that for the upper class, the quote, voluntary choice of childlessness accounts largely for the unparalleled condition. So I wanted to begin my talk by showing classicist employment of the general terminology of race mixing, a concept that gathered momentum throughout the 19th century. And the related term miscegenation would be coined in 1863 during the American Civil War and was specifically tied to debates over the abolition of American slaves. But Frank's focus on reproductive rates and use of terminology like race suicide, in fact, reflects a more specific movement emerging at the end of the 19th century, and this is the eugenics movement, an ideology derived broadly from 19th century racial science, but which, under the guise of heredity, sought to highlight a very specific building block of race, that of the family. So, I decided not to show a picture of Galton, but we'll be talking about him. And some of these slides are obviously what I mentioned before. We're starting to get into, well, we've been into some very difficult material. Eugenics is a term that comes from the Greek meaning well-born, and it originated in the work of Francis Galton. It proposed that selective breeding could be used to ensure the general improvement of human populations. And you can see some of the language on the slide. In a paper read before the Sociological Society at London University on May 16th, 1904, Galton himself defined eugenics as, quote, the science which deals with all influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race, also with those that develop them to the utmost advantage. Later in the talk, Galton would equate eugenics with religion, postulating that eugenics, quote, has indeed strong claims to become an orthodox religious tenet of the future. For eugenics cooperate with the workings of nature by securing that humanity shall be represented by the fittest races. What nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man may do providently, quickly, and kindly, end quote. Later in the talk, Galton would shift his definition of the aim of eugenics from that of bringing about the so-called best specimen in every class to making sure that what he called the useful classes themselves were able to become more predominant in the overall population, professing, quote, the aim of eugenics is to bring as many influences as can be reasonably employed to cause the useful classes in the community to contribute more than their proportion to the next generation. And all of that language is, of course, coded, but it means population. Contributing more is about the size of a population. It's a euphemism for literally numbers of people. Galton then proceeded to outline a course of procedure, as he called it, for putting eugenics into practice, offering 5 points, including the, quote, dissemination of a knowledge of the laws of heredity, and, quote, the systematic collection of facts showing the circumstances under which large and thriving families have most frequently originated. In other words, the conditions of eugenics. And such a systematic collection of facts was key for Charles Benedict Davenport, who was a central figure in the American eugenics movement, who founded the Eugenics Records Office in 1910 for that very purpose, for keeping statistics and data. And one way of gathering information, or the kind of data that they wanted about American families, was to sponsor these nationwide fitter families for future firesides competitions. And this is a picture of people entered into one of those. But it is Galton's second plank on your handout that is really most significant for us today, because he likewise advocated for, quote, historical inquiry into the rates with which the various classes of society, classified according to civic usefulness, have contributed to the population at various times in ancient and modern nations, end quote, explaining that, quote, here's him again, there's a strong reason for believing that national rise and decline is closely connected with this influence. And so that's part of what makes the beginning of antiquity so alluring for these scholars, is because they're trying to think of conceptions of so-called rise and decline. The call for such inquiry would find a welcome response in classical studies, both in the larger sense of using population change as a tool for tracking historical causality, so-called rise and decline, and also in eugenics' more narrow preoccupation with tracking the respective fertility rates of different groups over time. As Frank's article suggests, classical scholars would likewise latch onto a very potent term used by eugenicists to denote the perceived decline in birth rates, specifically among the upper class, race suicide. And I'll take a drink while I let you look at these disturbing cartoons. The term race suicide had originally been coined by sociologist Edward Ross, but they became strongly associated with President Teddy Roosevelt, and you can see on the right-hand cartoon that following a speech he gave in 1905 before the National Congress of Mothers, where he focused on the necessity of women ensuring the survival of the white race through their reproductive practices and choices, making motherhood a racial and national prerogative, and casting childlessness as a dereliction of public duty. And this, you can see then, like Frank's language of voluntary becomes very, very loaded in this context. And as many of you may know, Margaret Sanger, an important early advocate for birth control, connected herself strongly to the eugenics movement. The terminology of race suicide, with its attendant condemnation of certain kinds of childlessness, appears in the writings of a range of classical scholars. And this is, and I should just mention that the inverse of panic over race suicide was the forced sterilization that was increasingly practiced on other groups in American society, including those deemed to have mental and therefore moral deficiencies. And, you know, as many of you know, never forget that it's eugenics that gave us the IQ test. In the same year as Frank's article, Basil Gildersleeve, the founder of the American Journal of Philology, lamented in his columns that are called Brief Mention, he lamented, quote, the perpetual reference to the Great War, which has clouded the last years of my life. Finding what he said was no classical repose in Euripides, Gildersleeve nonetheless presented a list of quote unquote restful things one finds in Euripides, beginning with Ion, line 488, in which the chorus professes, I hate the childless life and I blame the one to whom it seems good. So that's what he found restful. And about this quotation, Gildersleeve merely commented, I pass over race suicide, though it is not to be passed over when one wonders how the earth is to be replenished after the war. So I want to give one additional example of the application of race suicide specifically in Greek antiquity, and this is by one of Gildersleeve's students, and it's even more openly expressed. At the 1924 meeting of the American Philological Association, and so this is some 8 years after Frank and Gildersleeve, the eminent Homeric scholar John Scott delivered a paper dispassionately, albeit grandly, entitled A Reason for the Decline of Achaean Civilization. When his talk was published in shortened form the next year, the title now bluntly named the reason, and the article was called Race Suicide Among the Achaeans. Scott began his discussion with an unqualified endorsement of eugenics, and this is also on your handout, professing, men who have at heart the moral and intellectual progress of any people are intensely interested in the number of children born in the families which represent the best in culture and in heritage. He himself defined race suicide as the, quote, growing tendency to rear constantly fewer and fewer children, and he then applied it to what he called the riddle of the collapse of the ruling Achaean families and their civilization. And he's presumably referencing here the fall of Mycenaean civilization during the Bronze Age. So he's trying to think about what this fall was due to. But instead of thinking, as archaeologists were doing, about things like Dorian invasions by using ostensibly material culture and mythology, Scott looked specifically at Homer. And he reminded his reader that whereas men like Peleus and Odysseus had fathered only one child, while Achilles' companions, Phoenix and Patroclus, had none, he said, when we turn to their foes or neighbors, we find a different story. Giving among his examples Andromache with her 7 brothers and Priam with his 50 sons, Scott concludes sternly that, quote, if the Homeric heroes were actually as sterile as they are pictured in Homer, it was inevitable that Achaean civilization should have been submerged under the waves of populous and expanding neighbors. And that populous and expanding neighbors seems to me to be very loaded in this context of immigration families arriving in the United States. And I don't pretend that Scott was even hinting at what we might today consider Achilles' passionate bonds with other men, i.e. this remarkable coincidence that it was Achilles and his cohort that he singled out as childless. But I do want to just underline that this points at the ways in which homosexuality was also a target for contemporary eugenics. Okay, but I want to return once again to Tenny Frank and look at how his ideas about race mixing and race suicide were taken up and debated by his contemporaries. In his monumental social and economic history of the Roman Empire, a work that had actually forestalled a planned second volume of Frank's own economic history, and the kind of rivalry or lack of rivalry between these two men is a really interesting topic. I would say rivalry on Frank's part, and Rostovtsev didn't, I think, consider Frank a rival. But in any event, Rostovtsev, a Russian immigrant who had arrived in the United States in 1920, grapples openly with the ways ideas from eugenics were being applied to the fall of Rome. In his discussions of the changing Roman population, Rostovtsev evoked the concept of race suicide, although sparingly, and he uses the term even less, but nonetheless asserts that by the later empire, quote, very few families, either of the upper or of the lower classes, cared to rear children. In a final section, Rostovtsev takes up the topic at greater length as part of an attempt to weigh what he considers, quote, one prominent feature in the development of the ancient world during the imperial age. That is what he called the gradual absorption of the higher classes by the lower, accompanied by a gradual leveling down of standards. So he's not thinking so much specifically of blood, but you can see some of the same kind of language. As one of the four general modes for explaining such a phenomenon, Rostovtsev calls attention to, quote, the rapid progress of medicine and biological science, noting that theories of degeneration and race suicide have been applied to the ancient world. He provides a more sustained rebuttal of Frank specifically, however, so his attitudes, I think, are much more complex. Writing, quote, against Frank, I may suggest that I see no criterion for distinguishing between inferior and superior races. Why are the Greek and Latin races considered the only superior races in the Roman Empire? End quote. Insisting that other races had produced their own forms of advanced civilization, Rostovtsev asks, why did the admixture of the blood of these races contaminate and deteriorate the blood of the Greeks and Romans? And as might be suggested by the quotation that I read earlier, Rostovtsev, especially given his own background, is much more inclined to use the language of class rather than race. Dismissing its value as a causal explanation, rather than completely dismantling any of its foundations, Rostovtsev cautions that, and this is on your handout, the theory of a natural decay of civilization by race suicide states the same general phenomenon of which we have been speaking, the gradual absorption of the upper classes by the lower, and the lack of assimilative power shown by the upper. It states the fact, but it gives no explanation. The problem this theory has to solve is this. Why do the best not reproduce their kind? It may be solved in different ways. We may suggest an economic or a physiological or a psychological explanation, but none of these explanations is convincing. Positing that none of these existing theories fully explains the problem of the decay of ancient civilization, although each, he says, has contributed, Rostovtsev concludes by asserting the relevance of such history or of such study to the present day, insisting that, quote, the evolution of the ancient world has a lesson and a warning for us, end quote. And so, I have to openly admit, I'm still grappling with Rostovtsev. I think there's a lot going on in his work, and especially in the way it's taking up some of the ideas of his era. But I'd like to turn to something else. In the next decades, the analogies to contemporary America would continue to infuse classicists' turn to eugenics in both implicit and explicit ways, even as eugenics was itself starting to lose its hold on American life. And this is really important to note that by the late 1920s, American scientists were really abandoning the eugenics movement. But it was only with Hitler's rise to power in 1933 and the devastation of World War II that eugenics would really fall out of American dedication altogether. But it's already in decline by the 1920s. But still, in a 1934 article suggesting some of the resiliency of the theory, even as it was starting to decline, especially among scientists, William Gray, in an article, opened with reference to President Roosevelt's inaugural address, in which Roosevelt called the United States, quote, a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world. Gray then noted that the current depression has doubtless suggested to many a parallel that is indeed obvious enough, the parallel between the present situation and that of the later Roman Empire. Acknowledging that many others had already drawn comparisons in both learned and popular periodicals, Gray insisted nevertheless that a number of the most important and interesting similarities have not, to the writer's knowledge, his own knowledge, been noticed. And he later proposes that, quote, in the social field, also depressing parallels can be traced. The outstanding one is perhaps this. In the Roman Empire, race suicide was prevalent, just as it is today in many modern civilized states. Attributing the phenomenon in antiquity to emigration and the civil wars, he argues that, quote, celibacy and the refusal of those who were married to have children were also important causes. Soon after, Gray added that, quote, in the early empire, race suicide seems to have been, as it is today, most prevalent among the more prosperous and better educated, end quote. Okay, in addition to once again then finding causality in race suicide, Gray's inclusion of civil wars as a possible reason for the depletion of the Roman upper classes is really significant. And indeed, the proposed connections between war and racial decline concerned many eugenicists, and that's not surprising, perhaps, in the early part of the 20th century. David Starr Jordan, an ichthyologist, who would become the first president of Stanford University, I'm sorry, there he is, was a prominent anti-war activist, one whose views leaned heavily on the science of eugenics. Believing that war eradicated the strongest men from the gene pool, Jordan, moreover, often used ancient Rome by way of illustration. In a 1906 lecture entitled The Human Harvest, Jordan proclaimed, and this is on your handout, the Romans of the Republic could not have made the history of the Roman Empire. In their hands, it would have been still a republic. Could they have held aloof from world-conquering schemes, Rome might have remained a republic, enduring even to our own day. The seeds of destruction lie not in the race nor in the form of government, but in the influences by which the best men are cut off from the work of parenthood, end quote. Earlier, linking the crisis in Roman paternity specifically to warfare, he explains that, quote, when the real men fell in war or were left in faraway colonies, the life of Rome still went on. But it was a different type of Roman which continued it. And this new type repeated in Roman history its weakling parentage, end quote. Ultimately framing a message for his own era, Jordan predicted, a republic shall endure so long as the human harvest is good, so long as the movement of history, the progress of peace and industry, leaves for the future not the worst, but the best of each generation. The Republic of Rome lasted so long as there were Romans. The Republic of America will last so long as its people in blood and spirit remain what we have learned to call Americans. In a later article, Jordan noted that, quote, we touch again on the overshadowing fact in the history of Europe, the effect of military selection on the human breed. I want to just contrast with that something that Rostovtsev said at the same time, who really challenged the currency of such ideas, and I think was really important from where he was coming from. And Rostovtsev wrote, quote, that he was not competent to sit in judgment on the problem of degeneration from the biological and physiological point of view, but pointed out simply that, and this is a response to the kind of ideas Jordan was promoting, quote, in wars and revolutions, it is not only the best that are exterminated, end quote. Without question, race and class had a very complicated interplay in eugenics and its ideologies, not least because class was so often closely correlated with race, as we've seen in many of these writers. But before closing, I want to see if I can briefly tease out some of the ways eugenics, and so also classical scholarship, reinforce the specific boundary between Black and white Americans, meaning the ways they sought to address not only the problem of race mixing with groups arriving from the outside via immigration, but also the problem, so-called, of incorporating now emancipated Black Americans into American society. Generally speaking, since there were already laws in the United States prohibiting marriage between Black and white Americans, eugenicists did not need to lobby for legislation aimed at preventing race mixing, so-called, between these groups, meaning Black Americans were not always the explicit target of eugenicist public advocacy, excuse me. And I'm not going to take the time to read the passage on your handout, but you can see one way in which, in Galton's speech, Blackness nonetheless still haunted, and it was very resilient in these ideas. But I'm not going to read that out loud. You might just take a look at that to think about that question. I would like to look more specifically at the ways that this question resonated in classical scholarship. So I want to give a few examples of the ways classical scholarship's treatment of the subject of slavery during this time sheds light on contemporary anxiety about the social status of freed Black slaves and their descendants. So you might go back, and this is really why I wanted to underline on the handout Tenny Frank's specific parsing out of these two groups, so-called ordinary immigrants and ex-slaves and their offspring. While seeking to determine the relative importance of these two groups, so these were these are sort of his test groups that he was trying to use with these ideas, Frank eventually boils it down to one main concern, linking the destructive Oriental or Eastern blood primarily to freed slaves from the eastern part of the empire. And you might remember that Mitchell and Shipley also, by the end of their ideas, were making reference to the specific impact of so-called slave blood. In placing such emphasis on freed slaves, Frank openly acknowledges that he goes against ancient writers who he believes have exaggerated the levels and so problems emanating from the entry of freeborn foreigners into Rome. So in other words, in order to make this case that in fact it was the so-called blood of ex-slaves that was the biggest concern in ancient Rome, Frank openly admits that is not what ancient evidence says. Ancient evidence is much more likely to be directed against immigrants. So Frank sort of admits that, but is making an argument against it. Later, when he turned specifically to the consideration of marriage and reproductive rates, Frank argued that, quote, the slaves and freedmen of the city were nearly as prolific as the freeborn population, and that nearly as is really important. So in other words, Frank doesn't think that the disparity can be explained through birth rate alone. He finds an answer, however, in the, quote, liberal practice of Roman manumission, which brought about a high rate of merging between the servile class and civil population. So that, in short, Frank isn't just pointing to the negative consequences of unequal reproductive rates, he's pointing to the dangers of manumission itself. In his Martin Classical Lectures at Oberlin College, published some 16 years later in 1932, Frank muted the topic of race considerably. Although he argued in a footnote that contemporary anthropologists were wrong to organize the study of race around physical criteria like cranial capacity, when the racial difference that mattered most in historical time, he says, was that of temperament. And so you can see a lot of different ways that how race is made manifest is also open to debate in these decades, whether it's made manifest in the physical body and or in some of these more abstract qualities. Yet professing broadly that, quote, one of the difficulties in an attempt to characterize Roman society is the paradoxical fact that the Romans in Cicero's days were so like modern man that one is apt to miss necessary distinctions. In other words, they're saying we're so like the Romans that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Frank insisted on calling his attention to what he considered an important contrast when it came to ancient and modern slavery. And this is on your handout. He proposed that the institution of slavery left consequences more serious to Roman society than to ours, because there slavery had proceeded to the point of checking salutary industries, and lack of racial prejudice had permitted a more active absorption of indigestible foreign elements into the body politic. And so if you read that again and again, you read it more closely, you can see that Frank is in fact arguing that the lack of racial prejudice is a bad thing. And of course, he's implicitly then advocating the need for such continuing prejudice and segregation in American life. A few years earlier in 1928, so also between the world wars, A. Duff adopted a similarly rosy take on discrimination, lamenting that Roman slave owners did not exercise, quote, wise and just discrimination when deciding who to free. And he wrote, this is on your handout, if instead of indulging their vanity and lavishing promiscuous manumission, slave owners had exercised a wise and just discrimination, they could have effected that only the better type of slave should enter the citizen body. How different would Roman society have appeared if masters had only given freedom in gratitude for good service and only sold it to those who had increased their peculium by honest means. The influx of Oriental blood would not have been so overwhelming, and further, the slaves freed in such circumstances would on the whole have been men of good character who had loyally served their masters and who might be expected to be good citizens, end quote. In short, frank and like-minded scholars not only then were stoking contemporary fears about race mixing and immigration through their readings of classical antiquity, but also when turning specifically to Roman slavery, were able to advance implicit arguments for the continuation of prejudice and discrimination against former slaves and their descendants. In advocating inequality, in short, they were advocating inequality, in short, as a defense against racial decline, while at the same time relitigating a question that seems unthinkable. That is, whether the kind of universal emancipation that had been practiced in the United States was somehow too liberal, whether there was such a thing as too great or too promiscuous a freeing of slaves. So now I'll just give a very, very quick wrap up. So despite the manifold problems we might find in his work, for sure, Tenney Frank was certainly correct about one thing. Our visions of antiquity remain deeply grounded in our own time and place. And although I want in this project to document the forms and consequences of eugenics and its ideologies in early American classical scholarship, I am also concerned with our present, with the ways such notions continue to fester, in no small part because classicists seem to have little appetite for acknowledging and reckoning with our own past, for recognizing and repudiating the distorted ways we have explained causality. And I can attest that even as we may find the topic uncomfortable, disturbing, unpleasant, there are many people outside classics who are rushing to fill that vacuum, who are deeply invested in perpetuating this racist view of antiquity, and they have no hesitation about using the terminology of white supremacy and eugenics to police it. So thank you all very much. I'm going to stop my share.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was fantastic. Let's give Denise a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Denise. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here on a Thursday afternoon, as David said. And I'm very happy to take questions or comments if, if there's a larger conversation people want to open up.
Well, that was a great talk.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it and learned a lot. This maybe goes without saying, but one of the things I was wondering about, the legacy of ancient historians is to view history from a moral perspective. Mm-hmm. And it lends itself to this kind of racist approach to history, doesn't it? I mean, the assumption that, going back to Homer, if you have someone like Eumaeus, the way you explain his nobility of character is that he was a prince at one point. But that's just one of the legacies that we don't consciously think about, I think, enough, that we've inherited from the Greeks and the Romans, this notion that it's not economic factors or social conditions, it's all about morality as it was understood at that time, which is character. Right? So anyway, that's just
which was perceived as very racially and was based in race and class, right? I mean, that's the fundamental problem, the idea that that was naturalized as pertaining to those classes and not being present in others. And I completely agree with you. In a different thing I've been working on more with John Scott and some of his Homeric stuff, because he wrote some other things that I think are also really of the moment, so to speak. And he really didn't like Thersites, and he has this statement, everybody in the Iliad is great except Thersites. And, and there's a way in which Thersites is described that mentions his head shape. And so during this era, these people are going crazy to interpret him according to craniology. And, so it's just, I completely agree with you that, and part of that is trying to figure out, what is Homer saying? Because we don't want to, overlook the ideology of Homer, but the way in which it folds into then some of these later ideas, I don't think we always acknowledge as classes, nor the way that we are the descendants of that. Part of the beginning of this whole project for me was feeling like, all the way back in graduate school, I had started to encounter like a eugenics light in some of my reading. When you read the greats of the field, I just felt like there's something still going on. Like we have not gotten rid of these ideas, even if we don't say them anymore. So yeah, thank you.
Oh, very good.
should I call on people, David, or I see someone
sure.
named Brady with a hand up?
Brady, do you have a question?
Oh, yes, I remember you mentioning industrialization near the beginning of your presentation. And I was wondering like how exactly like the classical historians back in like the late 19th, early 20th century tried to connect their fears of industrialization to economic and social forces back during the ancient days.
Yeah, I think, I really have two things to say about one. I think you can absolutely see a more general anxiety in the contrast between, city and countryside. I mean, Tenny Frank himself was the son of a farmer, and, reading his obituaries, it's really clear that he thought that that was really important, and that, the city and civilization was a degenerate place. And there's some of that also, the idea of the city as Madison Grant sees it, partially because of industrialization, right? So the city then, I think, is a really important part of that. But there are economic historians who I think are looking even a deeper dive into certain parallels. In one of the quotations, Tenny Frank talks about people studying industry. And it is out there like that. You do have economic historians. I'm sorry, I haven't done enough reading in that particular part, but if you look at economic historians of the 1910s and 20s, they are looking at things like production and industry and thinking about that. So I think it is really ripe to go back and look at that. How markets are set up. I just didn't do the economic as much as the racial ideas, but it is definitely there.
Thank you. I remember reading this satire from like ancient Rome, and remember hearing like the descriptions of this about how dangerous the city was, and how he wished he could go to the countryside. And that was kind of interesting, especially seeing parallels to the
definitely, and
current fears, I guess.
Yeah, and I think and what the city stands for, it stands for debauchery, but then when you pull it apart, a lot of it is coming from the people who are presumed to live in the city, right? Which is, someone like a Juvenal. I mean, he really writes anti-immigration tracts about what the city of Rome has become. Yeah, so thank you for your question. That's a great question.
Thank you. I really liked your answer.
Thank you.
Other questions? I guess I have one if other people aren't.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm also, I understand Zoom is not always,
Oh yeah, well, it's a different format for sure.
Yeah, very
Maybe
different.
people feel social pressure differently. At any rate, it doesn't matter.
You'll open it up, David.
My question kind of follows on John's. So we've been reading Petronius's Cana Trimalchionis in a course of mine this week, and it seems like there you have what look kind of like examples of both trends, because you have a dinner with a lot of both freed slaves or ex-slaves, and also with immigrants. And there's certainly an idea running throughout it, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, that's to the harm of the community, the greater Roman community. Not that the Romans who show up in Cana Trimalchionis are so great, but that's another issue.
Right.
So I'm wondering, to what extent do we find these ideas already present, in somewhat vivid ways in parts of Greek and Roman literature? And of course, if there are ideas you also happen to accept in your contemporary period, you might be attracted to those and then read them back in to the history when you're explaining the fall of Rome or other features.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that I think, and this is kind of maybe a roundabout way, I'm not sure it's getting directly your question, so I'll have to, maybe I'll become clearer as I'm talking, which is often a casualty, clarity. I think that part of what's interesting to me in the stuff that I'm reading is also the contemporary context and laws, and I think there's, eugenics is really about pushing laws. And I think what is sort of stunning to many of these writers, such as Tenny Frank, is that the Romans do not have legal restrictions for marriage, things like that. And that's one thing that Frank Snowden will get really interested in the 1950s. He wants to remind people that, that there were no marriage laws in Rome, and he sees Rome as being much like Greece, as not having racial discrimination in the way that he defined racial discrimination. So I think there's, some ways in which your point is a really good one. I think if we looked closer at certain things, there might be a lot more anxiety than people like Frank see on the surface of Roman texts, because they're so, I think, they're so focused on writers like Juvenal. I mean, and that I think is really interesting. Like if you talk to someone like Curtis Dozier, who's tracking the writers that people tend to talk about, it was fascinating to me that Tenny Frank is using the exact same writers. So, for example, I never saw Petronius in anything that they did, which is actually in itself sort of interesting. There seems to be this real sort of thread and genealogy of readings that really highlight Juvenal in particular, and satire, I think, altogether, some of the more formal Roman satire. So yeah, that would be interesting to think. And I don't even really remember Tenny Frank talking about freed with a D on the end, like freed men. He talks about free people and slaves, but he doesn't really seem, I mean, I'm sure he does in other works because he's hugely published, but in terms of laying out this kind of map of Rome, he doesn't really think about that category, which really would, I think, lead one to Petronius. You would have to think about Petronius when it comes to that. So yeah, that's a really great question. I'll have to think more about that and think about what they're not looking at as well, and some of the tensions and maybe social attitudes that they're kind of missing when they're looking at certain writers. For me, as I said in the talk, I think that the one that I grapple with the most, that I find most difficult, is Rostaltsev, because I think that, there's so many, I think his work is so monumental, and to see him grappling with these ideas in sometimes difficult ways, that's been the hardest for me. Frank, I think, is easy, in the sense of it's sort of easy to categorize where he's coming from and what he's doing. And, Rostaltsev is coming out of the Russian Revolution, and I think he has different ways of thinking about some of these questions, but I really want him to reject them more. I guess that's my struggle. I was at it, I was talking to someone about, Rostaltsev and Tenny Frank, and I said, why didn't Rostaltsev just bury him? Why didn't he just take him down? And the person said to me, I don't think Rostaltsev cared about Tenny Frank. I think Tenny Frank was just a sort of gnat on his, landscape. But it's clear that Tenny Frank felt a lot of competition with Rostaltsev. I just made that comment. He was writing an economic history of Rome, and when Rostaltsev's work was published, he stopped working on his for a while. So there's just some really interesting things I'm trying to tease out between their conversation or not. Sorry, that was way too much for your question.
That's extremely helpful. Yeah, thanks. Other questions? Oh, Danielle has one.
Oh, I had one that comes off of this. Danielle, did you have a similar question?
Yeah, go ahead, Jackie. My question is in a different direction.
Oh, okay, yeah, because in terms of in relation to what you're saying about Rostaltsev, what we're finding in my class, we're looking at Black writers at the same time, and what we're finding is the same commitments to these ideas, right? Even though they're actually writing, anti-racist, or they're trying to push back against the racism, but at the same time, you see the same sort of xenophobic immigration language about immigration, the acceptance of these racial categories and racial hierarchies, etc. So you want to say something about how ubiquitous these ideas were in terms of just intellectual discourse at the time, because it's kind of shocking. We just read Anna Julia Cooper, and I asked my students, did you find anything disturbing about some of the things she said about in her argument about race? And they were pointing out, wow, if you didn't know it was her, you'd be a little bit concerned, who is this? Yeah. So you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think that, part of what got me interested in eugenics was just trying to figure out, the sort of the larger American landscape, the ideas that people were absorbing, and sort of the playing field that they were in, because I think those were the ideas that were circumscribing, both what it meant to be racist and anti-racist. That was sort of the ideas that you worked with and you combated. And I think it's a real challenge with someone like Frank Snowden as well. I think Frank Snowden is, obviously did really, really important things, but it's very clear that he's within a very particular model of race. It was kind of interesting for me to find out that, in the 1950s, he was still arguing against Tenny Frank very explicitly. So the one thing I would say is, sort of, I think what you're hinting at, Jackie, which is for a certain proportion of intellectuals, these ideas are much more apparent for much longer. I think I was talking to someone about Tenny Frank and, what happened, and the person said to me, which I really want to think about and figure out how this works. But he said by the end of his life, Tenny Frank was sort of embarrassed by these ideas, or his friends were, and they were sort of, like toned down. And he said, you will not find them in his obituary, even though it's probably one of his most famous articles today. And so I think it is really important, and this goes back to the earlier comment as well, that we have to remember that even, what seems sort of surprising maybe to classicists to have to relearn about ourselves are present very differently and continuously present in a Black intellectual tradition. And they are actively writing writing against, in and around these ideas in much more explicit ways. And that's what I think it is really helpful to understand that and to think about how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and how that also changes. So yeah. And that's a great, I need to think more about that too. And some of this work is trying to plot more of that as well. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Danielle.
Thanks. I have kind of a two-pronged question. Have you come across people talking about the idea of the national project of the family in the same context of Augustan Rome? Do they lean that kind of because I was thinking about when you were talking, I could totally. I'm not familiar really with this area of research that you're in, but I could just imagine these scholars being like, oh, look at what Augustus was doing with his marriage legislation. And I wondered if that was also paired with a way of framing suffragettes as maybe like morally corrupt. And I didn't know if you had come across, and I'm speaking from, just curiosity, not really knowing much about it, but I wondered if you'd come across any of those references.
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I mean, that's a really great thing. And that's something I definitely want to think more about. If I, part of it is just trying to think about how to structure this project. But I do think that, I got very interested in the conversation about slavery in particular, because it did seem to me that people often talk about eugenics as being more directed at immigrants and not slaves. So I wanted to kind of pull that out. But I think, I really want to get back to the subject of the family, because I think that's clearly what eugenics is centered around and what all of this writing is centered around. And I think that, that has a lot to say about women. It has a lot to say about, homosexuality. I think there's a lot of other ways that I would like to approach some of this. And to your question, absolutely, people are looking at Augustan marriage legislation. And, so there is a sense of decline. There's, I can't think of the actual Latin language, but or the Latin phrase, but in Suetonius, there's a phrase that people have often interpreted as these marriage laws being about purity of blood, or maybe not the marriage laws themselves, but Augustus wanting a certain purity of blood. Not Frank Snowden, Lloyd Thompson writes a really interesting article in direct contradiction to that, which is great because, again, Lloyd Thompson is thinking about, and he cites actually Tenny Frank in this article. I think it's from well, if you email me, I'd be happy to give you the citation. I think it's like the 60s or 70s, but he opens up and he says, Tenny Frank says that, race mixing called the fall of Rome. We've got to be more careful about this. And Suetonius doesn't mean racial purity in our sense of racial purity. And it's an amazing article, both in the ways that Jackie addressed, because there's some things that I still wish he could have pushed further. He's still in a very particular mindset, but it's really clear that he is still grappling with Tenny Frank and the consequences of reading the Romans that way. And he does see the value of going back to this Augustan line and really trying to reread it. So absolutely, those are really important in this conversation about families and reproductive rates. Absolutely.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, thanks for this. This is really wonderful. I would sort of want to touch on something that maybe David brought up with his question, and I may be pushing the discussion too far afield because everything is really sort of, fall of Rome and the focus on that. But I'm wondering, especially in this idea of authors and ancient writers who aren't explicitly considered, but maybe creating a kind of intellectual subtext for these ideas that sort of permeate the way that we look at the ancient world in a less explicit or articulated way. The authors on the Greek side that sort of set a lot of these ideological foundations in place, you know, Aristotle's defense of slavery, you know, the airs, waters, places, and environmental determinism, or the Theognidean idea of animal husbandry as a sort of metaphor for, you know, social decay as a result of impurity and mixing of the good and the bad. If whether or not some of these authors are, or at least, I mean, it seems to me like that creates at the very least a kind of fertile soil for that. But I'm wondering whether or not it comes through in more explicit ways that you're finding in your research.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think that my own trail, aside from John Scott, who I've done some work, you know, with how he's reading Homer, has certainly been more on the Roman side. So my examples tend to be on the Roman side. I apologize for that. But, you know, one of the things, you know, in something completely different I'm writing, Tenny Frank is kind of obsessed with Terence, and he's obsessed with trying to figure out, you know, Terence's racial origins. And so I do think, you know, mapping a lot of this more broadly around these people, because I think, you know, in Tenny Frank's article, he's trying to look at Latin inscriptions, and his methodology is crazy. And he's sort of, you know, I think he kind of admits that, but it's clear that what he wants is data, you know, that he wants to do something that looks very objective. But I would say mostly, exactly as you're saying, the scholars of this era are using literature as their data. And they're really trying to bring together pictures out of that, such as Gildersleeve mentioning the line in the Ion. You know, I think there are these kind of authors and ideologies that keep recurring. So I definitely feel that is part of the broader mapping for sure. And like I say, I'm just a little bit less familiar with some of the way that the Greek material keeps reemerging, because I've been following the Roman trail a little bit more myself. But it's really helpful to think about that, because I do think there is a reading of the ancient world they're relying on, which is predominantly literary. Absolutely. I'm sorry, I don't know if that answered your question, but I really liked it. You know, David have given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, I mean, it did and it didn't, but I mean, that's usually the case, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, and I think, you know, I think one of the things I'm trying to do is, you know, link it to contemporary eugenics. So the fact that Tenny Frank wants to give data based on inscriptions is really interesting to me, you know, so I've sort of followed that rather than followed some of these other strands. So I would say that, you know, that I really appreciate, like, that I need to go back and think about some of these other things.
Well, yeah, and the idea of eugenics, I found especially sort of resonating with also a lot of classical Greek scholarship.
Yes.
With the ideas of, you know, the sort of aesthetics and, you know, all of these sort of 19th century efforts to take like Greek art and to use the proportions of Greek sculptures and to see which people matched most closely the distance between the eyes and all of this sort of, and of course Aristotle's ideas of you know, aesthetics and proportion and all that sort of thing are really big parts of the eugenics movement.
I completely agree. I think that, you know, this is a huge simplification, but I think that oftentimes when writers of this era are looking at Greece, they're thinking of racial purity. And, you know, they're thinking of racial mixing as a sort of the lesson from Rome. So I completely agree with you that both of those have a very important genealogy in the writings of this type. Yeah, absolutely. And certainly Greek sculpture does, is really important in some of these conversations, the readings of Greek sculpture. Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
So thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Any other questions? See a lot of students here. Anybody have a question for Denise after the talk?
Now you're really putting people on the spot, David.
I don't know what the Zoom norm is. Maybe that's unreasonable. I don't know.
I will just point out that Rebecca posted in the chat something that I do think, you know, if people haven't noticed it, she just says it's interesting how much of this language continued in classical scholarship well into the 1990s. And race, suicide language, Western cultural suicide appears on the blog of Victor Davis Hanson even in recent years, to which I'd absolutely say yes. I think, you know, there's a movement from race into culture, that concealed race for a long time in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But there absolutely is, to go back to the, original question about how much classicists really have to think about the prevalence and the rootedness of these ideas and the ways that we do what we do. For sure. But thank you to all the students for coming as well. It's really nice of you to come, and I hope you're enjoying your classes. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person. But make sure to pepper all of your professors with questions when you see them in the next class.
Oh yeah, and we're going to be, at least for my class, and I presume for Jackie's as well, we're certainly going to be discussing this in our next class, and there may well be a barrage of questions that emerge
Great.
afterwards.
Great. Oh, wonderful.
Continue the conversation over the next couple of days. Well,
My
okay.
class for sure, because this is exactly on the topic that we're doing. So this is perfect.
Yay. Well, thank you. I mean, there's a lot that I'm still trying to work through, and it's just always a great opportunity to get feedback and to think more and to think about some of the areas that I've gone down more enthusiastically than others. And I have to make sure that I think about some other things too. So I really appreciate that. I appreciate everybody's comments.
Well, let's give Denise a big round of applause. Thanks so much. That was really fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting. I know there's all sorts of work behind the scenes, so thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming. This is fantastic. The students are going to appreciate this.
Thanks so much. And again, thanks everyone for coming. We really appreciate it.
Yep, here's to good conversations, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.